I woke up alone, surrounded by the sterile cold of a hospital room, the sharp smell of disinfectant piercing the air. My head was a haze of pain, and the fluorescent lights overhead blurred into halos of harsh white light. My mind grappled with confusion, piecing together the last fragments of memory before darkness took over, screeching tires, shattering glass, and then nothing. As the fog of anesthesia faded, one terrifying realization dawned on me. Where was Emma? My heart raced, panic slicing through the remnants of grogginess. She had been with me right before the accident. Desperate, I pressed the nurse's call button, each beep echoing my escalating fear. When the nurse finally arrived, her face was a mask of professional concern. She explained gently that I had been unconscious for 3 days following a severe car accident. But when I asked about Emma, her expression shifted, confusion, then concern. They told me Emma had been picked up shortly after my admission to the hospital. By family, they said. But which family? The relief I should have felt never came. Instead, a chilling thought took root. Had Charles and Sandra, my in-laws, taken her? They had never hidden their disdain for me, especially after their son, my husband, had passed away. But surely even they wouldn't stoop so low as to jeopardize Emma's well-being. I tried to convince myself that Emma was safe, that my fear was just the byproduct of pain and medication. Yet, as the hours ticked by, with no word from my in-laws, a sickening possibility began to form. Had they abandoned Emma to get back at me? With my injuries a dull ache, I forced myself to sit up, the room spinning slightly as I reached for my phone. Missed calls and messages flooded the screen. Friends, Emma's school, even a voicemail from a neighbor, all asking the same question. Where was Emma? The pieces fell into place, each one a heavy stone sinking in my stomach. My in-laws had taken her, yes, but they hadn't cared for her. They had left her alone, unguarded, a 10-year-old girl in an empty house. Rage mixed with my fear, solidifying into a resolve as sharp as glass. This was no mere oversight. This was revenge. A cruel, calculated strike not just at me, but at an innocent child. As I lay there, forced back down by my own body's betrayal, memories of the past few years flooded my mind, each more painful than the last. Charles and Sandra, my in-laws, had always been a part of our lives, but not the supportive family one might expect. Even during their son's life, my marriage had been under their critical eye, never quite meeting their lofty expectations. Before the accident, tensions had only grown. After my husband's untimely death, they subtly blamed me for his demise. Their grief manifested not as sorrow shared, but as venom directed at me. They believed I had somehow led their son astray, that under my influence he had become less cautious, less his former self. Their son's death was an accident, a cruel twist of fate, yet they held me responsible, a scapegoat for their unbearable pain. Their coldness towards me had been bearable only because of Emma. Sweet, innocent Emma, who loved her grandparents despite their flaws. I had endured their hostility for her sake, hoping they would never extend their bitterness to her. But lying in that hospital bed, the harsh truth could no longer be ignored. The realization that they had abandoned their own granddaughter out of spite was a brutal awakening. How could they punish Emma for the fractured relationship between us? How could they use her as a pawn in their twisted game of revenge? The bond between Emma and me was strong, built on love and mutual respect, a stark contrast to the relationship I had with Charles and Sandra. Emma was my world, especially after her father's death. We had grown closer, our little team against whatever challenges life threw our way. But now, this deliberate act of abandonment threatened to tear that bond apart. I remembered the days leading up to the accident, the subtle warnings Emma had given me about her grandparents' strange behavior. She had mentioned, in her innocent way, how Grandpa Charles had been more stern than usual, how Grandma Sandra had whispered on the phone with someone about teaching lessons. I had dismissed these signs, attributing them to the usual stress that clouded their judgment. Now, as the weight of their actions sank in, guilt overtook me. Had I been too dismissive of Emma's feelings, too blind to the depth of my in-laws' resentment? This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting Emma from the toxic reach of people who should have been her protectors. Still confined to the hospital bed but now driven by a mother's desperation, I knew I had to act. My physical pain was secondary. Emma's safety was paramount. The first step was to reach out to anyone who might help piece together the puzzle of the last few days. I called Emma's school first. The principal, Mrs. Anderson, answered with a tone of relief that quickly turned to concern as she recounted the recent events. Emma hadn't been picked up by her grandparents as usual. Instead, a neighbor had seen her wandering near the school, alone and confused, hours after classes had ended. The image of my daughter, lost and scared, fueled my resolve. Next, I contacted my closest friend, Laura, who had left several frantic messages. She had gone to check on Emma at our house after failing to reach me and found the front door unlocked. Emma nowhere in sight. Panic had set in, and she immediately contacted the police. Laura's voice broke as she described finding Emma later that evening, huddled in her room, her eyes wide with fear. The pieces of the story Laura and Mrs. Anderson provided were like shards of glass, each one piercing deeper into the reality of my in-laws' callousness. They had indeed taken Emma from the hospital, but their care extended no further than dropping her off at an empty house, without even the basic decency to ensure she had entered safely. Armed with this knowledge, my next calls were to the local authorities. I explained the situation, my voice steady despite the swirling emotions inside. The officer on duty was sympathetic but clear. Without direct evidence of harm or malicious intent, their hands were tied. The legal nuances of family and guardianship were complex, and while they could check on Emma's well-being, prosecuting Charles and Sandra for negligence was another matter entirely. Frustration mounted, but my course was clear. If the law couldn't move swiftly enough to protect Emma, then I would. From my hospital bed, I started organizing a network of friends and family who could keep a close watch on Emma until I could get home. Laura agreed to stay with her until then, and other friends organized shifts to ensure she was never alone again. The betrayal by Charles and Sandra was a deep wound, but it also revealed the strength of the community that rallied around Emma and me. Each offer of help, each message of support, was a balm to the raw edges of my fear and anger. But more than that, they were a clear sign. We were not alone in this fight. Our battle was just beginning, and I was determined to shield my daughter from any further harm inflicted by those who should have been her safest haven. As my discharge from the hospital approached, my thoughts turned increasingly towards gathering concrete evidence against Charles and Sandra. The emotional and circumstantial evidence of their neglect was overwhelming, but I knew that for any legal or social repercussions, I needed irrefutable proof of their actions. Determined to expose their true nature, I began by requesting the hospital's security footage from the day of the accident. The footage clearly showed Charles and Sandra arriving at the hospital looking impatient and indifferent. Most damningly, it captured them leaving with Emma, only to return minutes later alone, without a care in the world. Their expressions, caught on camera, were cold and detached, far from the concerned grandparents they portrayed to the world. Next, I reached out to neighbors and asked if anyone had noticed anything unusual around my house on the day of the accident. To my relief, several neighbors had security cameras that covered the street. One neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, had captured footage of Charles and Sandra's car arriving at our home, Emma exiting the vehicle alone, and then the car driving off immediately after she entered the gate. This footage was crucial. It showed their utter disregard for Emma's safety and well-being. Armed with this evidence, I also documented every communication I had with Charles and Sandra since the incident, noting their evasive and sometimes outright hostile responses. I kept detailed records of their refusal to visit or inquire about Emma's welfare post-accident, which starkly contrasted with the concern shown by friends and other family members. With Laura's help, who had been a pillar of support throughout, we compiled witness statements from school staff and other parents who had noticed the abrupt change in Emma's routine and demeanor. Their testimonies painted a clear picture of Emma's distress and isolation during those terrifying days alone. This growing dossier of evidence was not just for potential legal action, it was also for the community. Charles and Sandra had maintained a facade of respectability and kindness in our town, but I was determined to expose their cruelty for all to see. They could not be allowed to brush this under the rug, to simply move on without facing the consequences of their actions. Each piece of evidence strengthened my resolve. I was not just fighting for Emma's immediate safety anymore. I was fighting to ensure that no other child would ever suffer at their hands. As I organized the evidence, I felt a shift within me, from victim to advocate, from powerless to empowered. Emma's plight had ignited a fierce protectiveness and a relentless pursuit of justice in me. Charles and Sandra had underestimated my resolve, and soon they would understand just how formidable a mother's love could be. With the evidence compiled, my next step was to engage with both legal avenues and the community to ensure that Charles and Sandra faced the consequences of their actions. My return home from the hospital was marked not just by a reunion with Emma, whose hugs were tight and whose eyes held a mix of relief and lingering fear, but also by a deepened commitment to our cause. I first consulted with a lawyer, a family friend, who had been following the situation closely. He reviewed the evidence meticulously, assessing each piece for its potential impact in court. While the legal system often moves slowly, especially in family matters, he was optimistic about our case. The evidence of neglect, particularly the security footage and eyewitness accounts, painted a damning picture that could not easily be dismissed. Simultaneously, I began to reach out to the community. Emma and I had always been active in local events, and the support we received was overwhelming. I shared our story with close friends and community leaders, careful to stick to the facts and the evidence. The response was immediate and supportive. Many were shocked that Charles and Sandra, whom they had known for years, could commit such a heartless act. Community meetings were organized not just to support Emma and me, but also to discuss broader issues of child safety and welfare in our neighborhood. It was clear that our personal ordeal had struck a chord, and the community was eager to rally for change. These meetings also served as informal gatherings to collect more statements and anecdotes about Charles and Sandra's behavior, which added depth to our legal case. Furthermore, I worked with local media outlets to ensure our story was heard. While I was cautious about exposing Emma to undue public attention, I also recognized the power of media in shaping public opinion and pressing for quicker legal responses. The story, framed as a cautionary tale of trust and betrayal within families, gained traction. Interviews and news segments aired, and the public's disdain for Charles and Sandra grew. This phase was not without its challenges. The public nature of our fight brought unwanted attention and sometimes harsh scrutiny. However, the overwhelming majority of feedback was positive, and the tangible support from our community fortified us. People offered everything from legal advice to daily assistance, making it clear that while Charles and Sandra had abandoned Emma, the community had embraced her. Through these efforts, we not only fortified our legal strategy, but also ensured that Charles and Sandra's actions were publicly known. They could no longer hide behind their social standing or manipulate narratives. The truth was out, and with it, a wave of community backing that they could not easily dismiss. As the community rallied and legal proceedings began to take shape, the emotional toll on both Emma and me became increasingly apparent. Emma, once a bubbly and outgoing child, had become more withdrawn, her smiles less frequent and more tentative. Despite the outpouring of support, the shadows of abandonment and betrayal lingered in her eyes. It was a painful transformation to witness, and it fueled my resolve to fight harder for justice. My own emotions were a tumultuous mix of anger, guilt, and determination. Anger at Charles and Sandra for their unfathomable cruelty, guilt for not having seen the signs sooner, and a fierce determination to protect my daughter from any further harm. Sleepless nights were spent planning the next steps, poring over legal documents, or simply holding Emma as she battled nightmares. The tension in the air was palpable when we encountered Charles and Sandra in public. Our small town, once a peaceful haven, now felt like a battleground. Whispered conversations would halt as we passed. Sympathetic looks were exchanged. The couple, once respected in the community, now faced the cold shoulder from those they had known for years. Their attempts to defend themselves only fueled the public's anger, as their explanations seemed shallow and self-serving against the overwhelming evidence of their actions. In these encounters, I held my head high, shielding Emma from their gaze. Our interactions were brief, fraught with unspoken accusations and the heavy weight of impending legal battles. Charles and Sandra tried several times to approach us, possibly to plead their case or seek a reconciliation, but I was unyielding. The safety and well-being of Emma were my only priorities, and I could not trust their motives. Despite the community's support, we faced challenges. Some community members, longtime friends of Charles and Sandra, were hesitant to fully accept the gravity of their actions. They suggested forgiveness and family mediation, not fully understanding the depth of the betrayal or its impact on Emma. These suggestions were well-meaning, but painful, reminding us that not everyone could see the clear line that had been crossed. Through it all, Emma and I relied heavily on each other. Our home became our sanctuary, where we could be ourselves, free from the judgment and the prying eyes of the town. In those quiet moments, we found strength in our shared resilience. We talked, played games, and slowly rebuilt the sense of security that had been so brutally stripped away. These moments of bonding were crucial, not just for our emotional recovery, but also for reinforcing the bond that Charles and Sandra had tried to sever. As the legal date approached, our preparation intensified. My lawyer, seasoned yet compassionate, meticulously went over every detail of our case, ensuring that we were ready for any arguments Charles and Sandra might present. We rehearsed our statements, fine-tuned our evidence presentation, and strategized on how to counter any sympathy ploys they might use to sway the judge. Simultaneously, Emma and I prepared emotionally for the confrontation. I spent nights talking to her about what was to come, ensuring she understood that no matter the outcome, we had done everything right. "This isn't just about us," I told her. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did." Emma, mature beyond her years due to the ordeal, nodded, her small hand squeezing mine in a silent promise of unity. Our case had garnered significant attention, not just locally but also in neighboring towns. The media, drawn to the dramatic narrative of betrayal within a seemingly perfect family, were eager to cover the trial. While this added pressure, it also provided a platform to highlight issues of child neglect and familial responsibility, which had become central themes of our ordeal. A few days before the trial, I organized a small meeting with our closest supporters and a few representatives from child welfare organizations who had followed our case. This meeting was not just to rally support, but to discuss broader initiatives that could be launched regardless of the trial's outcome. We talked about setting up community support groups and legislative changes to better protect children in similar situations. During this meeting, Emma surprised everyone by expressing her wish to speak at the trial. It was a decision we reached carefully, considering her emotional state and the potential impact of her words. We agreed that her perspective as the directly affected party was powerful and necessary for the court to hear. The night before the trial, Emma and I sat together going over her statement. Her resilience amazed me, her words poignant and reflective of both her pain and her hope for a resolution. "I want them to understand what they did to me," she said quietly. "Not to make them sad, but to make sure they never do it to anyone else." As I listened to her, my heart swelled with a mix of pride and sorrow. This journey had forced her to face unimaginable challenges, but it had also sculpted her into a beacon of strength and advocacy. The morning of the trial dawned clear and cold. The town seemed to hold its breath as Emma and I, hand in hand, walked into the courthouse. The media had gathered, cameras clicking softly as we passed. Inside, the courtroom was already filling up, a buzz of whispered conversations filling the air as people took their seats. Charles and Sandra were there, looking visibly shaken by the public turnout and media presence. They sat with their lawyer, a stark contrast to the community support that flanked Emma and me. The air was thick with anticipation and the weight of what was about to unfold. The judge entered, and a hushed silence fell over the room. He looked over the courtroom with a stern gaze before calling the session to order. The gravity of the moment was palpable, and Emma squeezed my hand tighter, a silent source of comfort to each other. My lawyer opened our case with a powerful statement, outlining the facts and the emotional toll their actions had taken on Emma. He presented the evidence methodically: security footage, witness testimonies, and the damning video of them leaving Emma alone at our home. Each piece was a blow to Charles and Sandra's defense, their faces growing paler with each exhibit. When it was their turn, Charles and Sandra's lawyer tried to paint them as grieving grandparents who had made a temporary lapse in judgment. However, their argument faltered under the weight of the evidence. Their attempts to evoke sympathy seemed desperate and insincere, especially when contrasted with the undeniable proof of their neglect. Then, it was Emma's turn to speak. The courtroom was utterly silent as she took the stand, her voice clear but tinged with the emotion of her ordeal. She spoke about the loneliness and fear she felt when she realized she had been left alone, about how her trust in what family meant had been shattered. "I thought family was supposed to protect you," Emma's words echoed in the silent room. "Not leave you when you need them the most." Her statement was powerful, resonating not just with those in the room but also as a poignant reminder of the responsibilities adults have towards children. The impact of her words was immediate. People in the courtroom looked visibly moved, some wiping tears from their eyes. Even the judge nodded slightly, visibly affected by the testimony of such a young, brave soul. As the trial concluded for the day, the community's support was overwhelming. Outside the courthouse, people gathered to offer words of encouragement and solidarity. The first day of the trial had laid bare the true nature of Charles and Sandra's actions, and public sentiment was overwhelmingly in our favor. The trial continued for a few more days, each session intensifying the emotional atmosphere of the small courtroom. Our lawyer methodically dismantled any remaining defenses Charles and Sandra might have had, reinforcing the cruelty of their actions with each witness and piece of evidence presented. As the final day of the trial arrived, the tension was palpable. Emma and I held hands, our bond a silent testament to the journey we had endured together. We sat, waiting for the judge to enter and deliver the verdict, surrounded by friends and supporters who had become our extended family through this ordeal. When the judge finally took his seat, the courtroom fell into an expectant silence. He took a moment before speaking, his gaze sweeping over us all. Then, with a clear voice, he delivered the verdict. Charles and Sandra were found guilty of child neglect and endangerment. The courtroom erupted into a soft murmur of relief and approval. The judge's sentencing was firm. Charles and Sandra were to face significant legal consequences, including community service designed to educate them on child welfare, a hefty fine, and a strict warning about future conduct. More importantly, they were legally barred from unsupervised contact with Emma until further assessments could be made. The verdict was more than a legal win. It was a moral victory. It affirmed that the community and the justice system stood on the side of protecting the innocent and holding the guilty accountable. Outside the courthouse, our supporters cheered softly as we exited, the relief and joy evident in their smiles and warm embraces. In the days that followed, Emma and I slowly began to find our new normal. The public nature of the trial had brought us unexpected attention, but it had also sparked important conversations within our community about child safety and the responsibilities of adults towards children. Local newspapers and TV stations covered the verdict, but more importantly, they highlighted the community's role in safeguarding its young members. Our story had inspired a series of workshops and seminars on child welfare, hosted by local organizations and supported by various community leaders. For Emma and me, the trial's conclusion was a closure of a painful chapter and the beginning of a hopeful one. We spent more time together, often surrounded by friends who had stood by us. Emma's strength and resilience continued to amaze me, her recovery bolstered by the love and support of so many. The weeks following the trial brought a palpable shift in our lives. With the legal battles behind us, Emma and I could focus on healing and moving forward. The community's overwhelming support had not only seen us through the darkest times, but had also laid the foundation for a new chapter in our lives. Emma, with her indomitable spirit, gradually returned to her old self. Her laughter, once rare and restrained, now filled our home again. She resumed her school activities and even took up new hobbies, her confidence buoyed by the supportive environment around her. Watching her rediscover joy was the greatest relief and reward I could have asked for. For me, the trial had sparked a deeper involvement in child welfare advocacy. The support and encouragement from the community led me to collaborate with local organizations. Together, we developed programs aimed at educating parents and guardians about child safety and the importance of emotional support for children. My experience had given me a unique insight, and I was determined to use it to prevent other families from suffering as we had. Our story also continued to resonate beyond our local community. Invitations to speak at events and seminars came in, giving us platforms to share our journey and the lessons we had learned. These engagements were not just about recounting our past, but about advocating for change and building a future where such betrayals of trust were less likely. As autumn turned to winter, our home became a hub of warmth and activity. Friends, old and new, gathered for meals and celebrations, each event a reminder of how far we had come. Emma, once shy and withdrawn in the aftermath of her ordeal, now thrived as a young advocate in her own right, often joining me in discussions or accompanying me to events. One crisp evening, as we sat by the fireplace, Emma curled up next to me with a book in her lap. She looked up, her eyes reflecting the flickering flames, and said quietly, "Mom, we did it, didn't we? We're okay now." "Yes, sweetheart," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. "We did more than just survive. We grew stronger, and we helped others along the way." As the fire crackled softly in the background, I realized that our journey had taught us both about resilience, justice, and the power of community. We had not only navigated the storm of betrayal and legal battles, but had emerged as beacons of hope and advocates for change. The pain of the past would always be a part of us, but it no longer defined us. Instead, it was our actions, our resilience, and our commitment to making a difference that shaped who we were. Emma and I together looked forward to a future filled with possibilities, ready to face whatever challenges it might bring with strength, courage, and the unwavering support of each other and our community.